Hi, my name's Greg, and I've always loved telling stories. So, grab yourself a cup of coffee and spend an hour with me by the fireplace as I try to unravel one of the strangest mysteries of our time. The story you're about to hear really happened, but I could never fully make sense of it. Even the professionals who worked on the case were left puzzled. If you enjoy mysteries without answers, stories that remain unsolved, then make sure to subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from. Let's begin. Part 1. The Perfect Escape. The summer of 2022 had a particular quality to it in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of golden light that locals knew would disappear with the first serious rainstorm in September. The sky was impossibly blue. The forests were impossibly green. And in Portland, Oregon, two young men named Garrett and Thomas Chen had decided that this particular Saturday in late June was the perfect moment to disappear into that green. Michael was 23, a civil engineering student at Portland State with the kind of meticulous personality that made him create spreadsheets for amusement. Dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the type of person who checked his work twice before submitting it. He had been having problems sleeping lately. Nothing diagnosed, just the low-level anxiety that comes with understanding that your life is supposed to mean something, but being unsure what that something was supposed to be. Thomas, on the other hand, was everything Michael wasn't. 24, a graphic designer at a small Portland agency, Thomas existed in a state of perpetual charm and carelessness that somehow always worked out. He cracked jokes at inappropriate moments. He'd quit his last job impulsively and found a better one 3 weeks later. He was the kind of person who made people want to follow him places, even if those places were undefined. They'd been best friends since junior year of high school, the kind of friendship that had survived college separations, failed relationships, and all the petty grievances that usually destroy friendships between young men. Michael grounded Thomas. Thomas reminded Michael that life wasn't an optimization problem. Together, they struck a balance. The camping trip was Michael's idea, though he'd barely had to convince Thomas. A section of the Cascades, roughly 3 hours northeast of Portland, supposedly less crowded than the main hiking trails, but still spectacular. Neither of them was particularly athletic, and both understood this was fundamentally an excuse to escape Portland's startup bubble and remember what silence felt like. They left at 6 a.m. on Saturday. Michael's 2008 Subaru Outback had seen better days, but ran reliably. Thomas drove the first leg, while Michael worked on his laptop, checking emails. By the time Michael took over the wheel, they were deep in the mountains, the city a memory, the air noticeably cooler. The trailhead was less impressive than Michael's research had suggested. Just a gravel parking area, with 2 other cars, and a weathered sign. They packed light, as planned. 2 hiking backpacks, a 4-season tent that Michael had researched obsessively before purchasing, sleeping bags rated for temperatures colder than anything June would bring, a water filtration system, some freeze-dried meals, energy bars. Michael also brought his GoPro, a camera he'd received as a graduation gift and was still learning to use. The camera came with a weatherproof hard case, the kind designed to survive being dropped off a cliff or dragged through a river. Michael had bought it precisely for that reason, though he hadn't articulated why he felt the need for such protection. The hike in took about 3 miles. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, crossing a small creek twice via log bridges that had probably been rotting for a decade. Michael checked his GPS compulsively. Thomas took selfies in front of trees. By late afternoon, they reached the site, a clearing beside the river, where the ground was relatively flat and trees provided windbreak. It was perfect in its ordinariness. They pitched the tent carefully, stakes deep, rain-fly sealed. Michael set up his GoPro on a small tripod, positioning it to capture both the tent and the river beyond. He switched it to time-lapse mode, 8 hours of recording, set to capture the fire as it burned down and the campsite through the night. It was 4:47 p.m. when he started the recording. The river was moving quickly, swollen with snowmelt, the sound of it filling the clearing with constant soothing noise. They built a small fire using scattered wood. Michael had brought hot dogs, buns, condiments in an insulated cooler. It was simple food, but out here it tasted significant. They sat on logs they'd pulled near the fire pit, watching the flames, and for a while neither of them said much. Thomas had one AirPod in. He always did. Music was a constant companion for him, even at moments that seemed to require silence. Michael had stopped trying to break him of the habit years ago. Around 8 p.m., as the light began to fail, Thomas suggested Michael record something for his vlog. Michael set the camera to time-lapse and repositioned it to capture the fire as it burned down, the tent glowing faintly in the background. They sat and talked for another hour as the fire consumed itself, about work, about girls, about stupid decisions, about what they might do with their lives if society suddenly stopped expecting specific things. By 10 p.m., they were ready to get into the tent. Michael had installed an LED lantern to read by. Thomas immediately sprawled in his sleeping bag and was asleep within 20 minutes. Michael lay awake, listening to the river, to the forest sounds, to the ambient noise of a world that existed beyond human interruption. He thought about his life, about how he was supposed to become something, and these thoughts felt easier out here. Around 11:30 p.m., Michael checked his phone before turning it off. He took a quick video of the fire, 30 seconds, capturing flames and smoke and the river sounds in the background. He posted it to his Instagram story with the caption, "Living my best life." It was 11:42 p.m. when he posted it. Then he switched his phone to airplane mode and closed his eyes. Neither he nor Thomas would touch their phones again. The moment everything changed. What happens next exists only in the evidence, in the footage, in the timeline, in the absence of witnesses and the presence of questions. Around 2:15 a.m., something disturbed the night. The forest has its own sounds, the rustle of animals, the settling of trees, the constant backdrop of the river. But sometimes there's a sound that doesn't fit, that makes every creature within hearing distance go silent. Sometimes there's a smell, sometimes there's just a feeling, a wrongness that ripples through the nervous system before the conscious mind can articulate what caused it. Michael woke suddenly, not groggily, not gradually, suddenly. His heart was accelerating, that fight-or-flight adrenaline surge that comes when the brain detects a threat. In the tent beside him, Thomas was still sleeping, his breathing steady and even. Michael listened. The river sounds continued. The normal forest sounds continued. But there was something else. A rustling, closer than it should be. Maybe an animal, maybe just the wind. But his body didn't believe that assessment. His body was telling him to stay alert. He unzipped his sleeping bag quietly, careful not to wake Thomas. He crawled toward the tent opening, every nerve ending activated. The night was cool, the stars impossibly bright. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest around the clearing was dark, but not completely dark. There was enough moonlight to make out the rough shapes of things. Michael's eyes adjusted gradually to the darkness. He stood at the tent opening, listening, waiting. And then he heard it, or thought he heard it, a sound that might have been human. Not quite a voice, but something rhythmic, something that suggested intention. "Thomas," Michael said quietly, "wake up." Thomas stirred, confused, waking into that state of disorientation that comes from being suddenly extracted from sleep. "What? What's wrong?" "Something's out there." Thomas joined Michael at the tent opening. They both stared into the darkness. The sound didn't repeat, but both of them could feel the wrongness in the air, the sense that they were being observed, that something had changed about their situation. "Probably a deer," Thomas said, but his voice didn't believe it. "I don't know," Michael replied. They stood at the tent opening for another 5 minutes, watching the darkness, listening to the forest. Nothing happened. No movement, no sound, no clear indication of what had disturbed Michael's sleep. Eventually, Thomas returned to his sleeping bag, pulling it up to his chin, but Michael remained partially awake, alert, listening to every sound the night produced. At 2:43 a.m., Michael heard Thomas gasp. "What?" Michael said. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "That sound. I don't know, like something moving through the trees." Michael listened, but the forest sounded normal to him now, just wind and water and the ambient noise of wilderness. "I don't hear anything." "Yeah, well," Thomas's voice carried a tremor. "I heard it. Something big." They lay in the darkness, both partially awake now, both alert. The forest continued its nocturnal business. The night continued its progress toward dawn. At 3:17 a.m., Michael made a decision. His bladder had been full for an hour, kept that way by adrenaline and tension, but now the pressure was too insistent to ignore. He couldn't hold it anymore. He told Thomas he was going to take a quick walk to pee. "Don't go far," Thomas said. Michael grabbed the flashlight they kept by the tent opening, a bright LED flashlight with good batteries, and stepped out into the night. He walked approximately 20 yards from the tent, toward the river, but not directly to it, far enough to ensure privacy. His body was still alert, still processing the wrongness they'd both felt, but this was a practical need that overrode the sense of dread. He found a suitable tree, positioned himself, and was in the process of relieving himself when he heard it. The sound was like nothing Michael had ever heard before. Not quite an animal sound, not quite human. It was rhythmic. 4 beats, then a pause, then 4 beats again. Like someone chanting, but distorted, like the sound was being filtered through something or traveled across a distance. The sound came from beyond the river, from somewhere deeper in the forest. Michael's adrenaline spiked immediately. Every fiber of his being told him to return to the tent. But something else, curiosity, confusion, the need to understand what he was hearing, kept him rooted to the spot. He held the flashlight, pointed it toward the sound, and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the near bank of the river, the water beyond, and then the far bank. For one frozen moment, the light caught something on the far side of the river. Something that might have been eyes, or might have been reflective material, or might have been nothing at all, just the way light refracts off water and bark. Michael stood there, breathing heavily, shining the light across the river. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The river continued to move, but the chanting sound, if that's what it had been, ceased entirely. The forest held its breath. Michael stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then he turned off the flashlight and jogged back toward the tent, his heart hammering in his chest. The decision. Thomas was waiting outside the tent, standing fully dressed, his face pale in the moonlight. "Did you hear that?" Thomas asked. "Yeah, I heard it." "What the hell was it?" "I don't know," Michael said. "It was coming from across the river. I think I saw something when I turned the flashlight on." "We need to go," Thomas said. "We need to pack up and go. Right now." "In the dark? We don't know the trail well enough." "I don't care. I don't want to stay here. Something is wrong. You feel it too, don't you?" Michael did feel it. He felt it in every cell of his body, the visceral sense that their situation had changed, that something about this place had shifted from safe to unsafe. But he also understood that hiking out in the dark was dangerous. They could get lost. They could fall. They could injure themselves. "Let's wait until dawn," Michael said, trying to convince himself as much as Thomas. "We'll pack up first thing, be on the trail by sunrise." "That's hours away." "I know, but it's safer than trying to navigate in the dark." Thomas wasn't satisfied, but he was practical enough to see the logic. They returned to the tent. Both of them climbed into their sleeping bags fully clothed, something neither of them had planned to do. Both of them remained awake, alert, listening to the forest. No more sounds came from across the river, but sleep didn't come either. The last known moment. At 4:12 a.m., Michael sent a text to his mother. He didn't know why he felt compelled to do it. His phone was in airplane mode, so the message wouldn't send until he reconnected to network coverage. But he typed it anyway. "We're okay, but something strange is happening here. If you get this, and you don't hear from us by Sunday evening, call the authorities. I love you." He didn't send it. He left it in his drafts. He also didn't tell Thomas about the message. Instead, they lay in the darkness, both awake, both alert, waiting for dawn. At 5:30 a.m., as the sky began its transition from absolute darkness to deep grey, Michael and Thomas began packing their gear. They moved quickly, efficiently, both of them silent. The wrongness had not faded overnight. If anything, it had intensified. The forest felt watchful. The darkness felt thick, like it was waiting for something. By 6:15 a.m., they had broken down the tent and packed most of their gear into their backpacks. Michael retrieved the GoPro from its tripod. He was in the process of placing it in the waterproof case when something made him pause. The fire pit. They had left hot coals, smouldering remains of the night's fire. The responsible thing, the thing the Forest Service recommended, was to fully douse it, to make sure it was completely cold before they left. Michael walked over to where the fire pit was and began pouring water on the embers. Steam rose. The coals hissed. That's when he heard it. A sound from the forest, close now, very close, perhaps 20 yards away. A sound like something heavy moving through brush. Michael didn't think. He simply moved toward the sound, flashlight in hand. Thomas called after him, but Michael didn't hear. He was operating on instinct now, the need to see what was making the sound, to understand what had disrupted their night. He walked into the forest, maybe 30 yards. The ground was uneven, covered in pine needles and moss. The sound had stopped, but Michael kept walking, his flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. "Michael," Thomas called from behind him, from the campsite. "Michael, come back." Michael stopped walking. He turned around to call back to Thomas, to say that he didn't see anything. They should leave now, get to the car, get out of the forest. But Thomas wasn't there, at least not in the way Michael expected him to be. What Michael saw, in those pre-dawn moments, was complicated and hard to process. He would never be able to articulate it clearly. He would never be able to explain it in a way that made sense. What he saw was Thomas, still partially visible at the edge of the campsite, approximately 60 yards away. But Thomas was moving, being moved, toward the river. His arms were extended, as if he were reaching for something. His body was moving backward, but his face was turned away from where he was going, turned instead toward Michael. Michael couldn't see what was moving Thomas. He just saw Thomas, being pulled or dragged toward the river, slowly, inexorably. Michael ran. He ran back toward the campsite, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating trees and shadows and nothing that made sense. He ran shouting Thomas's name, shouting anything that came into his head. When he reached the campsite, Thomas was gone. The river was 50 yards beyond the clearing, and Michael ran toward it, his heart absolutely hammering now, his lungs burning. He reached the bank and looked down river and across, sweeping his flashlight across the water, across the far bank. Thomas was there. No, Michael's mind couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Thomas was in the water, but not falling in the water, not struggling in the water, moving deeper into the water, his body partially submerged, his head still above water, but turned away from Michael, toward the center of the river. "Thomas!" Michael screamed. Thomas didn't turn. His body continued moving deeper into the water, and then, in the space of seconds, his head disappeared. The water closed over him. He was gone. Michael stood at the riverbank for perhaps 5 seconds, unable to move, unable to process what he'd just seen. Then his survival instinct activated. He ran back to the campsite, grabbed his backpack, grabbed the GoPro, grabbed nothing else. He had no plan. His mind was not working rationally. His body was simply responding to the overwhelming need to flee. He started running down the trail, the same trail they'd hiked in on less than 24 hours before. His feet didn't care about the uneven ground. His body didn't care about balance or safety. He simply ran, moving away from the river, away from the forest, away from whatever had taken Thomas. He made it approximately 400 yards down the trail before his foot caught on a root. He fell hard, his backpack tumbling away, his body slamming into the ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. He lay there gasping, unable to breathe properly, unable to think clearly. In the silence that followed, he heard it again. The sound from before. The 4-beat rhythm, like someone chanting. It was coming from back toward the river, back toward the campsite, back toward where he'd left Thomas. And beneath it, underneath the chanting sound, was something else. Something that might have been a scream, or might have been the wind, or might have been his own voice, his own terror, echoing back at him from the forest. Michael lay on the ground and waited for dawn, every muscle tensed, every nerve activated, every part of his mind screaming that something terrible had happened, and it wasn't over yet. Part 2. The absence becomes apparent. Catherine Garrett did not immediately worry when she didn't hear from her son on Sunday. Camping trips had a way of extending themselves. Young people had a way of losing track of time. She checked his Instagram story and saw the post from late Saturday night. The fire, the river sounds, Michael's smiling face briefly visible in the frame, and was satisfied that he was alive and having fun. She spent Sunday in a state of comfortable contentment. She read. She worked in her garden. She had coffee with a friend. She checked her son's Instagram one more time and noted that he hadn't posted anything new, which was normal for someone out in the wilderness. By Sunday evening, she expected to hear from him. By Monday morning, when she didn't, she assumed he'd extended the trip. Young people did that, especially young men with their best friends. They got out into nature and decided an extra night or two wasn't going to hurt. Monday afternoon, she was having lunch at a restaurant downtown when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. "Is this Catherine Garrett?" The voice was professional, concerned. "Yes?" "This is David Kemp. I'm Thomas Chen's employer. I'm trying to locate Thomas. He missed an important client meeting this morning and didn't call in. Has your son heard from him?" Catherine's internal alarms began to sound quietly. Michael didn't mention anything. "They're camping. They're supposed to be back today, actually." There was a pause. "Right. Okay. If you hear from either of them, can you have them call my office?" After hanging up, Catherine tried calling Michael, straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. She texted him. No response. She called Susan Chen, Thomas's mother, whom she'd met several times at various campus functions, and relayed the information about the missed meeting. "They should have been back by now," Susan said. Her voice carried the slight edge of concern that comes from not quite being worried yet, but beginning to move in that direction. "Maybe they extended the trip," Catherine suggested. "Thomas's phone is off. I've been trying to reach him all day." By Monday evening, Catherine Garrett had made a decision. She called the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and reported that her son and his friend were overdue from a camping trip. The dispatcher took the information and assured her that this was likely nothing. Hiking trips extended all the time. People lost track of time. The boys were probably fine. Call back if they weren't home by Tuesday evening. Catherine was not satisfied by this answer, but she was also aware that she might be overreacting. Parenting adult children was a delicate balance between remaining involved and allowing them autonomy. She decided to wait until Tuesday evening before escalating her concern. Susan Chen, meanwhile, was driving to the trailhead. The discovery. Susan left work at 3 p.m. on Monday and drove to the parking area where Michael had left his Subaru. It took her approximately 2 hours to get there. When she arrived, the car was exactly where Michael had left it on Saturday morning. Nothing had changed. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. The car sat in the nearly empty parking area like a monument to absence. Susan walked the trail for approximately 1 mile before turning back. The forest was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She called Michael's name. She called Thomas's name. Her voice disappeared into the green. By 6 p.m., she had called 911. By 7 p.m., the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office had initiated a formal search. Dogs and handlers arrived by 10 p.m. By Tuesday morning, helicopters were circling the forest, and by Tuesday afternoon, the search had intensified considerably, because by then, they had found the campsite. What the campsite revealed. Detective Marcus Webb arrived at the campsite at 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday, accompanied by his sergeant Linda Torres and 2 evidence technicians. Webb was 17 years into his career with the sheriff's office and had worked enough missing persons cases to recognize the patterns. Most of the time, people didn't vanish without explanation. 85% resolved satisfactorily. 10% remained genuinely mysterious. 5% fell into gray areas where the truth was never quite reached. But this campsite felt different. Webb could sense it before he'd even fully processed the evidence. The tent was still standing. The sleeping bags were unzipped but inside the tent. The backpacks sat on the ground, still packed. 2 flashlights lay near the tent opening, both with dead batteries. The cooler was still there, still containing the remains of food. The GoPro tripod was there, but the GoPro itself was missing. What was missing? Both of the young men's shoes, at least the ones they'd been wearing. Both their phones. Michael's waterproof camera case, their wallets, Michael's rain jacket, Thomas's light jacket, all of their outerwear, both pairs of their socks. So what? Webb said to Torres, standing in the clearing and surveying the scene. They decided to go for a midnight hike, barefoot, without phones. Maybe they went to the river, Torres suggested. Both of them, simultaneously, without discussion, and they both brought their wallets but left everything else. That doesn't make sense. Webb walked to the edge of the clearing where it transitioned into forest. He could see disturbance in the pine needles and moss. Not dramatic disturbance, but definitely marks that suggested something, or several somethings, had been moved or dragged. "Get the dogs," Webb said. The search dogs arrived within an hour, and they immediately became agitated. They paced near the disturbance marks, then followed something, some scent, toward the river. They became more agitated as they approached the water. One of the handlers, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who'd been training search dogs for 23 years, let the dogs work. She watched their body language carefully. The dogs were alert, distressed, indicating that they'd tracked whatever they were following into the water. "Current probably took them downstream," one of the handlers said. But Sarah Mitchell said nothing. She was looking at something that didn't quite fit. The dogs weren't just indicating drowning victims. The dogs were indicating fear, panic. Not the panic of an accident, but something else. Something that made the dogs themselves anxious. By sunset on Tuesday, search operations had been expanded. By Wednesday morning, divers were in the water. By Wednesday evening, they had found nothing. Nothing at all. Part 3. The footage arrives. 13 months passed. Search operations ended. The case remained open but inactive. Michael's mother and Thomas's mother maintained a website with case information. They held periodic vigils. They gave interviews to true crime podcasts. They waited for answers that never came. And then, on July 23, 2023, a call came from the county. 2 kayakers, paddling a section of the river, approximately 9 miles downstream from the campsite, had found something. A waterproof case, a GoPro inside. The device was water damaged, certainly, but when technicians dried it carefully and ran diagnostics, they made a discovery. The memory card was still functional. It still contained the time-lapse recording. Detective Webb sat in a dimly lit room with a monitor in front of him and watched the footage. The video was mostly dark and fire and shadows. 72 hours of footage compressed into approximately 9 minutes. For the first 5 minutes, nothing unexpected appeared. You could see the fire burn down. You could see the tent. You could see the normal progression of a camping night. And then, at the 5-minute mark, something changed. A figure, no, 2 figures, moved into frame from the right side. But they weren't walking. They were moving awkwardly, jerkily, as if they were being moved rather than moving of their own volition. Their arms hung strangely. Their heads were turned at angles that suggested they weren't directing their own movement. The time-lapse effect made the timing impossible to determine precisely, but the figures moved toward the tent. They moved around the tent, and then they moved out of frame toward the river. The footage continued for another 3 minutes of darkness and embers and empty campsite. Then it stopped. Webb watched it again. He rewound it. He watched it frame by frame. He called in the FBI. The FBI sent it to a video forensics team. The forensics team examined it for manipulation, for clues, for anything that would explain what was happening in the footage. Their conclusion? 2 human figures, moving in ways consistent with extreme distress or external manipulation. The video appeared authentic. The disturbance in the footage was consistent with panic or a sudden movement. The end time of the video placed the recording stop at approximately 4:45 a.m. Sunday, which was approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes before Michael was found wandering the trail, traumatized and barely coherent. That missing hour and 45 minutes of recording time suggested either a camera malfunction or an external event that had interrupted the time-lapse function. The forensics team could not explain which. Part 4. What Michael said. Michael had been found by a search dog on Sunday morning, approximately 400 yards down the trail from the campsite. He was badly dehydrated, suffering from shock and severe anxiety, and not entirely coherent. He was transported to a medical facility, where he spent 3 days recovering from the physical trauma. When he was finally able to speak clearly, Detective Webb interviewed him. "I don't remember everything," Michael said. He was pale, thin, his eyes carrying a quality of profound dislocation. The night was... it wasn't right. There were sounds. Something in the forest. "What kind of sounds?" Webb asked. "Like a chant. 4 beats, repeating. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't anything normal." "Did you see anything?" Michael hesitated. I think I saw Thomas being pulled into the water, but I can't explain how. I can't explain what I saw because it doesn't make sense." "Can you try?" "There was something moving him. I couldn't see it clearly. I just saw Thomas being moved backward into the river, and I couldn't stop it. I tried, but I couldn't stop it." Webb leaned forward. "Did you see anyone else? Another person?" "No, just whatever was moving Thomas." "What do you think it was?" Michael looked directly at Webb, and in his eyes was a kind of plea. "I don't know. I know what I saw, but I don't know what it was. It wasn't human, but it was there. It was real." The rest of the interview was inconclusive. Michael's account was internally consistent, but described events that didn't conform to any standard explanation. He couldn't identify what he'd seen. He couldn't explain the mechanics of how Thomas had been moved. He simply maintained that something in the forest had taken his friend. Webb's official report stated that Michael had likely experienced extreme stress and confusion during whatever incident had occurred. His recollection, while sincere, might not be reliable as evidence. The official narrative remained that both young men had likely entered the river and been swept downstream, with their bodies dispersed beyond recovery. But Webb kept the video. He kept Michael's interview, and he kept the unanswered questions. Part 5. The Missing Pieces. 2 years later, in July 2025, Detective Webb prepared a final report. The case would remain officially open, but practically inactive. His conclusion: Michael Garrett and Thomas Chen most likely entered the river during the early morning hours of Sunday, June 25, 2023. The exact circumstances remained unclear. The recovered GoPro footage documented disturbances at the campsite consistent with panic or crisis, but the footage provided no conclusive explanation of what had caused the panic. Michael's survival suggested that whatever had occurred at the campsite had had some motivation or intelligence behind it. Drowning victims don't typically result in one person surviving and one person disappearing, but the nature of that intelligence could not be determined. Webb concluded his report with a line that would remain in the case file. Whether the incident was caused by animal attack, environmental hazard, foul play, or something else entirely, the evidence does not provide definitive answers. The missing time in the GoPro footage, combined with Michael's account of events he could not adequately explain, suggests that more occurred at the campsite than can be reconstructed from available evidence. However, without physical evidence, definitive identification of the causative factor is not possible. The case remains unsolved. Catherine Garrett stopped maintaining the website about 6 months after Webb closed the case. She donated Michael's camping gear to charity. She kept his glasses, his class ring, his favorite coffee mug. She established a scholarship in his name at Portland State University, 1 scholarship per year for a student in civil engineering. She never remarried. She never had other children. She worked as an accountant for 30 more years, and in her office she kept a single photograph of Michael, taken on his 23rd birthday, smiling at the camera. Susan Chen, similarly, threw herself into work. She obtained her practitioner certification. She never discussed the disappearance of her son publicly after the case was closed. But people who knew her reported that she sometimes stood at windows and stared out at the forests beyond the city, her expression unreadable. Epilogue. The river's memory. If you visit the Cascade River today, you'll find it looks exactly as it did before. The camping spot where Michael and Thomas pitched their tent is indistinguishable from any other clearing in the forest. The river runs cold and fast, and it keeps its secrets with the ease of something that has been keeping secrets for millennia. But there are stories. Hikers report feeling watched when they camp in that area. Some report unusual sounds in the night. Most of the time, these reports are followed by reasonable explanations: wind, animals, the normal sounds of a forest that exists without human infrastructure or comfort. But sometimes the explanations don't quite fit. Sometimes hikers report hearing a rhythmic sound in the dark: 4 beats, then a pause, then 4 beats again. Sometimes they report seeing movement in the peripheral darkness that doesn't quite correspond to any known animal. Sometimes they report feeling an overwhelming sensation of dread that has no logical basis. In 2027, a group of online researchers obtained copies of the GoPro footage and began to analyze it frame by frame. They spent hours enhancing shadows, adjusting contrast, searching for details that might explain what they were seeing. Some claimed to identify a second figure in the footage, something large, something moving with purpose, something that seemed to operate behind or beneath the 2 human figures. Others dismissed these claims as pareidolia, the human brain imposing patterns and meaning on ambiguous visual data. The truth is that the footage remains ambiguous. It documents something. It doesn't explain what that something is. Michael Garrett's unsent text message to his mother was discovered when the Subaru was thoroughly examined. It remained in his phone's draft folder, never sent, a message that read, "We're okay, but something strange is happening here. If you get this, and you don't hear from us by Sunday evening, call the authorities. I love you." Investigators could determine that the message was typed at 4:12 a.m. on Sunday. They could determine that Michael had been alone in the tent at that time. They could not determine what compelled him to type it, or why he never sent it, or what he feared might happen to them. As for the river continues its flow. It has moved countless tons of sediment downstream since that June night in 2022. It has carried logs and stones, and the occasional lost hiker's gear. It has maintained its secrets as rivers do, giving up some mysteries while holding others tight. 2 bodies were never found. 2 families were never given closure. And in the forest beside the river, in the clearing where the campsite was pitched, the trees remember. They remember the sounds of distress. They remember the temperature of that night. They remember, if trees can remember anything, the moment when the forest took something it didn't give back. The case remains open. The river keeps its secrets. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Portland, beyond the reach of rational explanation, the forest continues its ancient business, watching and waiting, and keeping account of those who venture into its green. Final thoughts. I've spent 2 years investigating this case, and I'm no closer to understanding what happened than I was on the day they were reported missing. The evidence we recovered, the GoPro footage, Michael's testimony, the missing hour and 45 minutes of video, all suggest that something occurred at that campsite that fell outside the bounds of normal experience. What that something was, I cannot say. The most I can offer is uncertainty, and the acknowledgement that there are places in this world, wild places beyond the reach of infrastructure and law, where things occur that we may not be equipped to understand. This is the mystery of Michael and Thomas. This is what the river keeps hidden. If you have any information about this case, if you've heard something, seen something, experienced something in those forests that might be relevant, I urge you to come forward. The families deserve answers. Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more mysteries that I cannot fully explain.